I'm going to tell the story of when my 1-year-old daughter had to have a bowel resection due to gastroparesis, which was caused by shaken baby syndrome. And so just a little warning up front here, this can be a little bit graphic to some people who, just may take it that way. And so I'm telling her, true story, but it may make you uncomfortable if you're someone who doesn't want to hear, certain medical things that can happen to a child after they're shaken and once they experience gastroparesis and things like that. But I'm going to tell the very real story, so I'm not going to sugarcoat it, I guess you could say. So anyways, my daughter Krista was shaken when she was 3 months old. She suffered very severe disabilities due to that. She lost almost all brain function, but she survived it for 3 years. And so throughout that time, she suffered different things, going on in her body because of the brain damage. And so her brain didn't function properly, and that caused a lot of different things to go, wrong in her body. And one of those things that it, highly affected was her GI system. And so she was diagnosed with gastroparesis not long after she was shaken, and she was given a 24-hour feeding tube that gave her very slow feeds because her stomach couldn't tolerate anything. And so it was actually called a GJ tube compared to what most people or most children usually have, which is just a G tube. And so that goes directly into the stomach, and you can feed a child through the G tube going directly into their stomach. But since she had the gastroparesis and her GI system just didn't work that well, and it had to go directly into her intestines, so that's why she had what they call a J tube, which is connected to the G tube in the stomach, but there's a line or a tube that goes directly into the intestines. So she could still get nutrients that way and survive, but nothing ever went into her stomach. Okay, so this caused a lot of pain for her to have the J tube, but also it set her up for more chance of infection because there was just always the tube there, and she had to have a lot of surgery, and there's a hole in your stomach and things like that. So she did end up with this major intestinal infection, and I'm going to tell the story about that because, I don't know, why not just tell the story? So she all of a sudden got very sick, and she started vomiting. She never had anything on her stomach, so she very rarely vomited unless there was something seriously wrong, because nothing was ever on her stomach. And so when she did vomit, that would tell me why, what's going on the inside, because there's nothing, there shouldn't be any fluids in her belly. So it's coming from somewhere else internally. And so she was about 1 year old, and this was around, I guess, 9 months after she had been shaken, or about a year after she had been originally, shaken. And so she had seen a GI doctor several times throughout that time. She had had a few surgeries to have the J tube placed into her stomach and then replaced a few times. And she did certain things like water therapy and things like that to where she could have been exposed to a GI issue. But so this was like a Friday evening, and she just started vomiting this very bright yellow stuff, and I was like, this is not normal, this never happens with her, what's going on? And so I ended up having to call her on-call GI doctor, and they're like, oh, well, just bring her in Monday, it sounds like she just has some acid reflux, it's no big deal. And if you have ever had a special needs child, your child more than anyone does. And I was like, I don't think that everything's okay, but I'm going to keep an eye on her. So just within a few hours, she just started to look more and more lethargic, and she had these big circles under her eyes, and she started getting these, like, her veins became very prominent in her chest, and usually you couldn't see the veins running through her chest, but they were just becoming more and more prominent. And I'm like, this can't be okay. This is not just acid reflux. What do I do? They're telling me not to go to the ER, to wait till Monday to be seen. And then she started to have things coming out of her tube. So she never had things coming out of her tube, fluids coming out of her tube. So I was like, there's something in her stomach, something is happening. So I called the GI doctor back, in which, the one on call, which is usually not like her main doctor, but once again said, I think it's just, this is just how these children are. Sometimes these things happen. And, they didn't even really go into detail with me asking questions as far as like, well, what is her normal? They don't even ask that. What's her normal? They're just assuming they know. They just assumed that he knew everything and was just like, oh, sounds like acid reflux. Click. I'm on call. I'm not going to deal with this. So I ended up at like 1 a.m. calling my mom saying, please help me take her to the ER. There's something wrong. I know there is. I told the doctor, I don't think you're right. I'm taking her to the ER. Could you please just call the ER and let them know I'm coming and what's going on? So I don't know if they ever did that or not, but we got to the ER, and because at the time I was a single mom. So that's why I was calling my mom to, get some help at the ER because I had been working all day. So we get there and they basically say they can't find anything wrong, even though she looked completely different than she normally looked. She was so sick looking. She had dark circles under her eyes. She had this yellow fluid coming up. None of that was normal for her. So sometimes if you have an experience like that, you have to go with your gut feeling. And I knew something was wrong with her. And so I told them, I'm not going home. There is something wrong with her. This is not normal for her. So they're like, okay, well, we'll admit her and observe her. But we did an x-ray and we can't find anything wrong. And she was swelling at this point. Her stomach was like distended and swelling. And then at that point she had brown stuff, which looked like a mixture of blood coming out of her tube area and her nose and things like that. And so how could you not think something was wrong? I don't know. But by the next morning, because we were there all night long, and by the next morning they had said everything was fine. They come rushing into the room that we were in, and so we have to take her for a stat CT scan because she's an organ failure, kidney failure, organ failure, something like that. And so I was like, finally, someone's doing something about this. And, I was surprised by what they found because they come back and said that she needed to go for emergency surgery immediately. They had called the on-call surgeon because it was the weekend and he was on his way there to do surgery and she probably wasn't going to survive. So they came in, the anesthesiologist people, they came in and were telling me that what I was signing was basically her life away, that she was going to die during surgery because there's no way that she could survive going under anesthesia in the state that she was in. So they even circled death on the paper and said, I want you to know and understand that this is probably the outcome. And I was like, okay, very traumatic situation, very traumatic feelings. I mean, it was just awful. So I was telling her goodbye and they took her back for surgery and she somehow miraculously survived. So I remember her being back for surgery for, I don't know, maybe it was an hour or 2 hours. And I just remember sitting there thinking, what is it going to feel like to walk out of the hospital with an empty car seat? Am I even going to take the car seat home? Or am I just going to leave the car seat here? And, I kept thinking those thoughts and I was like, no, I'm just going to believe for the best and I'm going to trust God that he knows what's best. So if she survives, then she survives. If she dies and he takes her, then she dies. And so I basically surrendered that to God and was like, a lot of people judge me a lot of times because they're like, you kept her alive, you shouldn't have, she should have been a DNR the entire time. You never should have done any interventions to save her life. But the way I see it is not that way. The way I see it is if God really wanted her to go, she would go. Like there is no stopping his timing, regardless of whether she's on life support or not. She's going to be, leaving if that's what God wanted. And so I always had that outlook on it. So anyway, at that time, she was not a DNR. She eventually became a DNR, but at that time she wasn't. So they took life-saving measures, to save her life, which was the surgery. So she had this surgery. The doctor came out, said she survived. She was in very critical condition, didn't know if she would make it still. But what they did was, this is where it's going to get graphic, cut her stomach open, pull her intestines out, cleaned them out, cut a piece out that was infected and swollen and dead, I guess, and then put them back, or no, they had to hang them outside of her body in a bag so that they could swell and do what they call sludging, because if you just were to attach them back together, the sludgy stuff would come out and it would never heal and cause more infection. And so that's what I was to expect to walk into in the ICU where she was at, in a medically induced coma and all of that. So I end up going into the ICU to see her. What he described was there. She had literally her body, her intestines were hanging outside of her body in a bag. And, that was to swell. That was just the medical intervention they had to do. And they said she was still in critical condition. That's a very vulnerable position to be in, of course, and didn't know if she would live. So she did end up living through all of that. We were in the hospital for like 90 days, and they had to do a few different surgeries on her intestines, and then she lived, and it was like it never happened. They eventually were able to sew everything up, and she was just the same she was as before then. And so whenever I hear people say, you should have just let her die, like, what do you mean I should have just let her die? She would have died a horrible, terrible death. She would have smothered to death. Like, how could you say that is, more, I don't know what the word would be for it, but more loving to do to someone? Because at that point, her intestines were so swollen when I took her to the ER that they were pushing on her organs. So it appeared that she was an organ failure because they were so swollen. So if I hadn't went to get her help, because I had the mindset of what some people think I should have, which was, I'll just let her die. Just let her die. It's her time. I'm not going to get her help. She should just go ahead and die because she's better off. If I had sat and done that, then she would have smothered to death, a very painful, horrific death, where her lungs would have just eventually been smushed inside of her body. So, heck no, I don't regret my decision whatsoever to go get her help, regardless of what people say about that. So anyways, yeah, she was like, it had never happened. So, I trusted God with that, and I don't regret that decision at all to get her help. And these are just things that can happen when you shake a child. You would never imagine that one little moment of shaking a child could lead up to something so horrific. Yes, she did suffer. And yes, I would rather her have not ever suffered through that and just been with Jesus to begin with and not had to deal with any of that. But she did, because of someone's choice. And so, anyways, I wanted to share that story. I think it's an important story. I think it's important to realize that a moment of weakness, a moment of shaking a child can cause so much more than just, an instant death. It can cause a long-term suffering like it did for her. So, thanks for watching this video all the way through. I put this story and the rest of our story in my book, Going Through Trials with God, 7 Lessons Learned Through Shaken Baby Syndrome, which can be found on Amazon or Audible. And feel free to share this video. But yeah, I'll see you on the next video.